Messages that self-destructed. Cases that disappeared. The whistleblower who wouldn't let truth be erased. They called her reckless for challenging a federal judge. Then she proved he was running a shadow justice system. The courtroom was silent. You could almost hear the rustle of papers as Judge James Boasberg adjusted his black robe. That fabric whispering like a guilty secret was a bit too much. His face, usually a mask of authority, betrayed a flicker of unease. A tightening around the eyes, a slight paling of his complexion, those were the signs. For over a decade, he'd been at the center of the federal judiciary's most charged cases. Immigration battles that shaped border policy, national security hearings that decided the fate of classified programs, disputes between intelligence agencies that never saw the light of day. Those rulings of his were dissected in hushed tones at Georgetown Law School seminars, debated in K Street lobbying firms' secure conference rooms. And yet, they were never really held up to public scrutiny or accountability. He moved through the legal world like a ghost, present everywhere but untouchable, his influence woven so deeply into the system that questioning him seemed as futile as questioning gravity itself. Then came Pam Bondi. With a single press conference that would soon be replayed endlessly on cable news, she tore open the veil of judicial invincibility, holding aloft a thick stack of sealed documents like a warrior raising a sword. "This is not political," she declared, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of barely restrained fury, her piercing gaze locking onto every camera lens in the room. "This is about trust, and Judge Boasberg has broken it." The reaction was instantaneous. Reporters lunged for their recorders, legal analysts gasped audibly, and across the country, ordinary citizens sat frozen before their screens, minds racing, with the same urgent questions. What unspeakable breach had this powerful judge committed? And why was Bondi, once considered just another cautious bureaucrat, now transformed into a relentless crusader, the one finally holding him to account? Disturbance lurked behind the scenes. Not just one bad ruling or an isolated lapse in judgment, but years of calculated manipulation. That's what you'd find if you followed the trail of breadcrumbs through the darkest corners of power. Boasberg hadn't just interpreted the law, he'd weaponized it. In his courtroom, truth went to die. Immigration. Cases, high-profile ones, would mysteriously land on his docket. Then they'd get delayed indefinitely. Sensitive national security matters would be shunted into closed hearings where there was no public record. Whistleblowers who dared challenge government overreach found their evidence suddenly barred from admission. The system protected him, because it was him. The system, that is. Favors were exchanged in quiet lunches at the Monocle restaurant. Outcomes were predetermined in hushed phone calls that left no paper trail. Bondi was reviewing a routine deportation appeal when she noticed something that didn't add up. A discrepancy in timestamps. A missing document that should have been filed. A defendant with cartel ties released on Boasberg's verbal order alone. That was the moment professional intuition kicked in. It sparked an investigation that would uncover something far more terrifying. The justice system wasn't broken. It had been hijacked. The more Bondi's team dug, the more they found. Each new revelation was more shocking than the last. Boasberg hadn't just bent the rules. He'd rewritten them to serve a network of powerful interests. A whistleblower from FAUD, the D.C. Circuit Court, someone who'd spoken to me on condition of anonymity, provided internal memos showing how Boasberg had manipulated case assignments to get favorable outcomes for connected parties. A former judicial clerk broke down, in tears during a deposition. She described being coerced into backdating documents to cover up delayed rulings. The immigration cases were the most chilling, dozens of them. Dangerous individuals with extensive criminal histories, known gang affiliations, terrorist ties, released because Boasberg had issued verbal stays that contradicted the written evidence. One case haunted Bondi's sleepless nights. The story of a young Border Patrol agent left paralyzed after being ambushed by a suspect Boasberg had released 6 months earlier, despite multiple violent felonies. The mother's handwritten letter, stained, with tear marks, never left Bondi's desk. That was a visceral reminder this wasn't just about politics. Real lives had been shattered by this man's arrogance. Then came the revelation that changed everything. The recovered signal messages, obtained through an exhaustive subpoena process that pushed the boundaries of legal authority. The encrypted communications laid bare a conspiracy that reached far beyond one rogue judge. "Keep this one in my courtroom," read one particularly damning text exchange between Boasberg and a senior DOJ official. Too risky for anyone else to handle. Another thread hinted at deliberately delaying a high-profile surveillance case until after a pivotal election. But the most explosive was a message from a former deputy attorney general to a political operative. "JB says we'll bury it in pretrial motions. No panic. This never sees daylight." When Bondi read those words for the first time, her hands trembled not with nervousness, but with white-hot rage. This wasn't just about judicial misconduct anymore. This was about a cabal of powerful figures operating a shadow justice system, and Boasberg was their ringmaster. The press conference that followed sent seismic shocks through the entire political establishment. Bondi didn't merely level accusations. She meticulously dismantled Boasberg's entire career, presenting a chronological roadmap of corruption that left no room for spin or deflection. Charge after charge landed like hammer blows. Obstruction of justice for intentionally delaying sensitive cases, willful concealment for hiding communications about pending matters, failure to recuse in at least 17 instances where he had clear personal connections to parties before him. The backlash from the legal old guard was immediate and vicious. Prominent law professors decried it as a dangerous politicization of the judiciary. Former attorneys general penned op-eds warning about setting a terrible precedent. But their protests rang hollow to a public that had seen too many powerful figures escape accountability. Because for the first time in memory, someone was naming the quiet corruption they'd always suspected, but could never prove. The trial itself became a national spectacle, not for courtroom theatrics, but for its almost clinical exposure of systemic rot. Boasberg's defense team, comprising the most expensive attorneys in Washington, crumbled under the weight of documentary evidence. Former allies refused to testify on his behalf. When the verdict finally came, disbarment, immediate removal from the bench, and a scathing recommendation that hundreds of his past rulings be reviewed for impropriety, it wasn't just a personal humiliation for one arrogant judge. It was a watershed moment for American justice. Yet as the TV cameras packed up and the chattering class moved on to the next scandal, one uncomfortable truth remained. Boasberg couldn't have operated alone. How many other judges were making similarly questionable decisions from their insulated chambers? How many prosecutors looked the other way when politically connected defendants received special treatment? The system Bondi exposed wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as designed to protect its own. Her fight had cracked open the door, but now the real question hung heavy in the air. Who would be brave enough to kick it all the way down? When judges become lawbreakers, should they face prison time like any other citizen? Or does judicial independence require different standards? Want more explosive investigations into power and corruption? Subscribe. For the stories no one else will,